Hi, everyone. Today in biology, we're going to be discussing the cell membrane and how different molecules get back and forth across the cell membrane. So as you remember from previous lessons, the cell membrane is made up of a combination of lipids and proteins, specifically phospholipids, as you see here pictured in the light orange and the blue. And that phospholipids have a hydrophilic head and hydrophobic tails. And then we've got a variety of different types of proteins that are embedded within the membrane to allow for transport and signaling and securing to the cytoskeleton and things like that. So as you remember, the cell membrane is semi-permeable, which means the majority of molecules cannot naturally cross the cell membrane without some sort of aid or support. Now, for a cell to exist, we have to be able to, on the most basic level, get nutrients in and wastes out. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. So all cells, as you remember, have a cell membrane, right? But some also have a cell wall, so that's the slight difference there. And what we're going to focus on to begin with is the concept of diffusion, which is the basis for why molecules will cross the cell membrane in the first place. So diffusion is the process where molecules naturally distribute themselves from where there's a high concentration to where there is a low concentration. So if we see here, we have molecules of dye, like food coloring. We're representing a cell membrane here with the gray, and we just have water on the other side. Those molecules will naturally distribute themselves until they reach equilibrium due to something called the second law of thermodynamics. So you remember the first law of thermodynamics we talked about earlier this year is matter cannot be created or destroyed. The second law of thermodynamics is based off of entropy, which is the measure of disorder in the universe. And it's stating that the universe is always heading towards greater and greater disorder. So basically what that means, if we see here in this image on the far left, these molecules are actually very organized. They're very ordered because they're all in one place. They're all in one location. Over here on the right, by them being at equilibrium, which means they're equally distributed on both sides of the membrane, we actually have the greatest amount of disorder we could have because they are randomly spaced out from each other as much as possible. So the process of diffusion, or molecules naturally separating themselves from high concentration to low concentration until they're equally distributed, does follow that second law of thermodynamics. So, moving forward, we know that diffusion is that movement from high concentration to low, but it's considered passive transport. It's considered passive transport because it doesn't require any energy to do so. Let me give you an example to see if this would make more sense. If you sat a ball on the top of a hill, a steep hill, and let go, what would happen? You should be saying to yourself, the ball would roll down the hill. That's because things will naturally, passively, without energy, go from a higher amount to a lower amount, a higher hill to a lower hill, so on and so forth. So no energy needed. And we can see here, this is a nice sample showing water moving back and forth across the cell membrane. Now, this is previewing something else I already talked about. You'll notice that these green molecules, whatever they are, when they hit the membrane, they are just bouncing back off. That's because whatever they are, they must not be able to cross that semi-permeable membrane. And we'll discuss that more momentarily. The process of the movement of water is called osmosis. All that is the diffusion of water specifically across the membrane. So we know it's the boundary of the cell membrane from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. And we know it's important that it's semi-permeable because that's going to keep negative things outside of the cell. But we do need to be able to get some things inside and out. So can it be impenetrable? No. Right? So we need to be able to get food, carbohydrates, sugars, proteins, amino acids, lipids, salts, oxygen, water in. You've got to be able to get ammonia, salt, carbon dioxide, water, and products that the cell actually produces out. The problem is with that phospholipid bilayer, with the tails of the phospholipids being hydrophobic, they are naturally going to repel anything that's hydrophilic. The problem is the majority of molecules in life are hydrophilic or polar or charged. meaning most molecules are not going to be able to passively diffuse. Okay? So, what can get through directly? Fats and other lipids. Basically, anything that's also hydrophobic or nonpolar is going to be able to just diffuse straight across the membrane with no help. Sugars, proteins, anything else that's sizable or that has a charge of any kind is going to be blocked by those hydrophobic tails. That includes amino acids, water, salt, ammonia, etc. So what do we need? We're going to need something that's going to let polar molecules, ionic molecules, and large molecules through the membrane. We are going to do this with protein channels. The protein channels are represented on the left here with these colored cylinders. On the right, we see a better image of the tertiary structure, if you remember back to your protein structures, of the transport protein here, showing that it's made up of what's called a beta-pleated barrel. Lots of beta-pleated sheets and alpha helices formed into a circular barrel shape. So specific channels only allow specific materials through. That's why the color coding is here. It's trying to make a point that a protein channel will not just let anything through. So we see we have a protein channel for sugars, one for amino acids, one for water. Those are called aquaporins. That's a good thing to know. One to let salts out, and one to let ammonia out. So these protein channels are going to allow diffusion to occur through a process called facilitated diffusion. So if something can't pass the membrane simply because it's not able to pass through the lipid bilayer, but it can still pass through without energy via something called facilitated diffusion. This is still passive, no energy. It still goes from high concentration to low concentration, but now we use the aid of a protein to help get those molecules through where they normally could not. Right? So they move specific molecules across the cell membrane. Always low to high. Excuse me, always high to low, from the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill. Okay? Sometimes you can hear these protein channels called the bouncer because they do only let specific molecules through, not just any molecule through. They are controlling still what gets into the cell and what comes out of the cell. Now, what if you have a scenario where the cell needs to get all of something out of the cell or all of something into the cell? Regular diffusion always leads to equilibrium, which means you have an equal amount of molecules or atoms on either side of the cell membrane. Well, what if it's waste? You want all of it out. What if it's food? You want all of it in. So then we're going to need something called active transport. This is when you're moving molecules against that concentration gradient. So this is where you're going from where there are less to where there are more. Now let's go back to our ball on the hill scenario. You put the ball at the top of the hill, you let it go, it'll naturally roll down. How do you get that ball back to the top of the hill? You have to push it. You have to carry it. You have to do something where you expend energy to get it there. So when we do active transports, right, it's going to have a shape change in one of these proteins that allows molecules to move from one side of the membrane to the other, but it's going to have to pump them with energy. Remember, energy in cells is called ATP. So if anybody has a sub pump in their basement, so when there starts to get water in their basement, it pumps it up out of their basement, up against gravity. You'll notice that thing's plugged into a power source or wired directly into your house is electricity because it requires energy to make molecules go in a direction they would not naturally go in. So that protein undergoes what's called a conformational shape change. This is very similar to what we learned that enzymes do, and it's a way that they ensure only the correct molecules are transported actively across the membrane. They, again, can be considered a doorman because they're only letting certain things in, okay, and certain things out. So to summarize, we have two types of passive transport, which remember means they require no energy. simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Simple diffusion is only going to be for molecules that are nonpolar and can easily fit in amongst the nonpolar tails of the phospholipids. Facilitated diffusion is going to be for molecules that are polar, ionic, or too large for simple diffusion, and they go through the aid of a protein channel. Then we have active transport, which is where we have molecules going against the concentration gradient, against what they would naturally do, using ATP to be pumped through a protein from one side of the membrane to the other. That's it for our lesson today. Thank you very much.